Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The virus was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the public heard the first whispers on the news, entire cities were already in chaos. Hospitals overflowing, streets choked with fear. The media labeled it the Phoenix strain, an apt name for something that seemed to rise from the ashes of normalcy and burn everything it touched. But the true horror lay in its origin and the hidden hands that had carefully constructed it. Mark Donovan knew that better than anyone. Dr. Mark Donovan sat hunched over a dimly lit workstation in his makeshift lab. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, running simulations and scanning data, but the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. Weeks of near-constant work had whittled him down to skin and bone, and every hour was a reminder that time was running out. He adjusted his glasses, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and focused once more on the numbers flashing across the screen. This strain wasn't too like anything he'd seen before, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. The sterile white walls of the lab felt like they were closing in on him. He had once been part of a top-tier research team, a virologist with a promising future. But now it was just him, isolated from the world, racing against time in a desperate attempt to find a cure. Outside, the world burned with panic and sickness, while inside, Mark fought the oppressive silence. His thoughts drifted to the past, to the epidemic that had claimed his family years ago, tragedy that left him scarred, emotionally and mentally. He had promised himself that he would never let something like that happen again. And yet here he was in the midst of another outbreak, one far deadlier than the last. Suddenly, the sharp trill of his phone broke the silence. Mark flinched, nearly knocking over a stack of papers as he grabbed for it. The name on the screen made his heart race. Sarah, his old colleague from the CDC, one of the few people he still trusted. "Mark, we need you, Sarah's voice was hurried, her usual calm demeanor fraying at the edges. "The situation is worse than we thought. This strain ... it's evolving faster than we can track. People are dropping like flies." Mark leaned back, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know, Sarah, I've been monitoring it. This thing ... it's not natural." There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that only confirmed what Mark had already suspected. "We've been getting strange reports," Sarah said, her voice lowered to a whisper. "There's something going on behind the scenes, something the government isn't telling us. I think this virus was engineered, marked deliberately." Mark's stomach turned. He had thought the same thing, but had pushed it down, convincing himself it was paranoia. Yet hearing Sarah say it made it real. Who would do this and why? "I don't know," she replied, "but Helix Industries, they were too involved. They've been controlling the flow of information and the resources. And there's something else. People are disappearing. Mark, scientists, doctors, those who know too much." Mark swallowed hard. "You think they'll come after me?" A cold silence stretched between them. Sarah didn't too need to answer for him to know the truth. "You need to be careful," she said. "Finally, I'll help however I can, but we're running out of time. We need to find a cure, and we need to figure out who's behind this before it's too late." The call ended, leaving Mark with a creeping sense of dread. Helix Industries. He had heard rumors about them, whispers of unethical experiments, genetic tampering, and corporate greed. But this was something else entirely. If they were behind the virus, then humanity was facing a danger far greater than a mere pandemic. Mark stood from his desk and grabbed his jacket. His lab wasn't safe anymore, not if Helix was involved. He quickly packed what few supplies he could into a worn backpack, vials of samples, data drives, and his personal note. He had to go off the grid, disappear before they found him. His only hope was to meet up with Sarah. Maybe together they could piece together the truth and develop a cure. He turned off the lights and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. The streets were eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. In the distance, he could hear the faint wail of sirens, a reminder that the city was on the verge of collapse. As he walked briskly down the alley, his mind raced. If Helix had engineered the virus, they had done so for a reason. Population control, a bioweapon, Mark couldn't truly be sure. But one thing was clear. The virus was designed to spread quickly and mutate even faster. Humanity just stand a chance unless he could stop it. Just as Mark rounded the corner, he caught sight of a black SUV idling across the street. His heart skipped a beat. The windows were tinted, but he knew immediately who they were, operatives sent by Helix to find him. He quickened his pace, keeping his head down, his mind screaming at him to stay calm. He couldn't lead them to Sarah. He had to lose them first. With his backpack slung over one shoulder, Mark slipped into a narrow side street, his breath coming in short gasps. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps behind him. They were following. His pulse quickened, and he broke into a run, weaving through the dark alleyways of the city, his mind calculating every turn, every shadow. He cursed under his breath. He wasn't cut out for this kind of thing. He was a scientist, not a fugitive, but now he had no choice. Felix had made sure of that. As he sprinted through the maze of streets, his mind flashed back to his family, their faces, their laughter, the way they had vanished from his life, like a dream dissolving into the morning light. They had been taken by a virus just like this one, and Mark had failed to save them. He wouldn't fail again. He ducked into an abandoned warehouse, his chest heaving with exertion. The footsteps were getting closer. He could hear them now, steady and deliberate. They were closing in. Mark scanned the room, his eyes landing on a set of stairs that led to the roof. Without hesitation, he bolted toward them, taking the steps 2 at a time. The cold metal railing burned against his palm, but he didn't care. He had to keep moving. He burst onto the rooftop, the city sprawling out before him, a labyrinth of concrete and steel. He could hear the operatives below, their voices low and authoritative. They were searching the building. Mark looked around frantically, his gaze settling on a fire escape that led down the back of the building. He climbed over the edge of the roof and onto the narrow metal ladder, his hands trembling as he descended. The sound of footsteps echoed from below. They had found him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he descended faster, his feet slipping on the cold metal rung. He could see the ground below, just a few more feet. He could make it. He had to make it. Just as he reached the bottom, he heard the crack of gunfire. Mark threw himself to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The operatives were shooting at him. He had to move. Scrambling to his feet, Mark took off into the night, his legs burning with exhaustion. He could hear the operatives shouting behind him, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. They were gaining on him. Mark's mind raced. He needed to get out of the city. He needed to find Sarah. She was his only chance, their only chance. But first, he had to lose the operative. He darted into another alley, his eyes scanning for a way out. Ahead, he saw a manhole cover. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and yanked it open, the smell of sewage wafting up from below. It wasn't ideal, but it was his only option. Mark lowered himself into the darkness, pulling the cover back over his head. The world above faded away, leaving him in the cold, wet silence of the underground. He crouched in the shadows, his breath coming in, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the operatives above, their footsteps echoing against the pavement as they searched for him, but they wouldn't find him, not here. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Mark let out a long, slow breath. He had escaped for now, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they found him again. Helix was relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. He stood in the darkness, his mind racing. He had to keep moving. He had to find Sarah. Together, they could figure out the truth. Together, they could stop Helix. But time was running out. Mark moved through the damp, narrow tunnels beneath the city, guided only by the faint glow of his phone screen. The sewers were a maze, but he had no choice above ground. The city was crawling with operatives, and Helix was undoubtedly watching every exit. His body was running on adrenaline, and though his muscles ached, he pushed forward, the weight of his backpack and the urgency of his mission driving him. Every so often, he stopped, listening for any sign that he was being followed. But the only sounds were the steady drip of water from the tunnel walls and the occasional scurrying of unseen creatures. He checked his phone again, sending a brief message to Sarah. "I am underground safe for now. Meet at waypoints." "Sarah, sir," his reply came quickly. "Understood. Be careful." The tension was suffocating, but knowing Sarah was out there fighting alongside him gave Mark the sliver of hope he needed. He'd always admired her strength, her ability to remain calm under pressure. Now, more than ever, they had to stay sharp. Mark navigated his way through the labyrinth, eventually finding an exit that led him out into a rundown industrial district. The streets were deserted, and the windows of the old factories were dark. The place had been abandoned long before the virus hit, but that made it perfect for staying under the radar. As he moved through the shadows, his mind kept replaying everything Sarah had said about Helix Industries. The thought that the virus was a manufactured bioweapon dawned out at him, threatening to erode his sanity. The sheer cruelty of it, that people were dying, not from some natural disaster, but from deliberate human actions, was too much to bear. It felt like every step he took weighed heavier with the knowledge of what he'd uncovered. Finally, Mark arrived at the meeting spot, a dilapidated storage warehouse near the edge of town. The building was a relic from another time forgotten and left to decay. He slipped inside through a broken side door and waited, keeping close to the walls, his nerves fraying as the minutes ticked by. A faint rustle from the far side of the warehouse made him freeze, but the moment he saw Sarah's familiar figure emerge from the shadows, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You made it," she said softly, her voice thick with relief. She looked more tired than usual, the lines under her eyes deeper, but her focus was sharp as ever. "Barely," Mark replied, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Helix sent people after me. They know I am getting too close." Sarah frowned. They were getting more aggressive. "We don't have much time." Mark handed her a USB drive. "Everything I got from my lab is on here. We need to analyze the data, see if there's anything we missed." Sarah nodded, pocketing the drive. "I've been hearing more rumors about Helix. They were not just covering up the virus, they were controlling who gets the vaccine. There's something off about the whole operation." Mark says blood ran cold. "Are you saying they already have a vaccine and they withholding it?" Sarah's lips tightened. "That summed up what it looks like, but it's Sarah not ready for mass production. They were holding it back until the virus reaches critical mass, then they'll release it to select groups for a price." Mark's hands clenched into fists. They were going to let people die just to maximize their profits. I knew they were corrupt, but this... Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It gets worse. I've been digging into their files, and it looks like Helix has been working on this virus for years. It wasn't time meant to get out yet, but someone released it early. Whether it was intentional or a mistake, I don't know, but they were scrambling to contain the fallout." Mark paced, his mind racing. "So what do? We can take them head on. They've got too much power, too many resources. We expose them." Sarah said Obsidian is working on decrypting more of their files. "Once we have enough evidence, we leak everything. The public won't stand for this, not when they know the truth." Mark wasn't convinced. He had seen how powerful corporations like Helix operated, how they manipulated the media, buried scandals, and silenced whistleblowers. "You really think that'll be enough? What if they find us before we can release the data?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hard. "Then we take them down with us." Mark could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had always set her apart. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for justice, and now so was he. "All right," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "What's the next step?" "Obsidian's got a lead on one of Helix's secondary labs," Sarah explained. "It's us where they were developing the vaccine. We break in, get the data, and prove they've been holding it back. If we can get a sample, we can replicate it and release it to the public." Mark nodded. "Sounds like a suicide mission." Sarah smirked. "That's the spirit." They spent the next few hours going over their plan in detail, marking escape routes and contingency plans in case things went wrong. But even as they prepared, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The virus was mutating faster than anyone had anticipated, and every day they waited, more people died. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The knowledge that he might be one of the few who could stop this nightmare from consuming humanity. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows of the warehouse, Sarah stood up, tucking her gear into her bag. "We need to move." Mark followed suit, his body aching from the lack of sleep, but his mind razor sharp. Together they slipped out of the warehouse and into the early morning streets, where the world felt eerily quiet, as if it too was waiting for the storm to break. They made their way to the outskirts of the city, where Helix's secondary lab was hidden in plain sight. From the outside, it looked like a typical corporate office building, sleek, modern, unassuming. But Mark knew what lay beneath the surface. This was where Helix had been running their experiments, where they'd been developing the virus and the vaccine that could save millions if only they would release it. Mark and Sarah positioned themselves in the shadows across the street, waiting for the right moment to strike. The lab was heavily guarded, with security patrols circling the perimeter. But they had a plan, and Obsidian side hackers had already taken down the building. External camera ready, Sarah whispered. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let's do that." They moved quickly and silently, slipping past the guards and into the building through a side entrance. The inside was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the wall. Mark's skin crawled as they made their way deeper into the facility, passing rows of empty offices and labs filled with gleaming equipment. Finally, they reached the central lab where the vaccine was being developed. The room was filled with high-tech machinery, and at the far end, a row of containment units held samples of the virus and the vaccine. Sarah moved to the computer terminal, quickly typing in commands as she accessed the lab as stated. "I am in," she said, her voice tense. "I am downloading everything." Mark kept watch, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But just as the download finished, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. His stomach dropped. "They coming," Mark hissed. "We need to move." Sarah grabbed the USB drive, tucking it into her jacket as they sprinted for the exit. But as they rounded the corner, they came face to face with a squad of Helix operatives, their guns trained on Mark and Sarah. "Freeze," one of the operatives barked, his voice cold and mechanical. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no way out, they were trapped. But then, without warning, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. A second later, the building cell fire alarm blared, the deafening sound echoing through the corridor. Obsidian Sarah whispered, a hint of a smile on her lip. In the chaos that followed, Mark and Sarah slipped past the confused operatives and out into the night. As they ran, the sound of sirens and shouting faded into the distance, replaced by the steady beat of their footsteps on the pavement. They had the data, they had the proof. Now all they had to do was release it to the world. But as they disappeared into the darkness, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Helix wouldn't give up that easily. They were too powerful, too ruthless. And Mark knew that the battle for humanity's survival had only just begun.